Right. We are blessed today with somebody in our community who serves on our board and who went to Unity 5 Cities, or excuse me, Unity of San Luis Obispo, lo those many years ago. And so she is, she's an artist and graduated from Cal Poly, and that was when she was 52. And as part of that journey, she spent 10 weeks in Thailand. And she loves nature, animals, and all people, believing we are all connected. So here is Ethel Tink Landers.
Oh, what a blessing. Oh my, I'm a little loud and I'm not even being myself yet. Oh. What a blessing to be here. And I have to tell you, when Brian asked me to do this, I probably looked like a deer in the headlights, right? It's like, really? Speak in church? And then I remembered back in the days of Unity San Luis, I don't know how many of you might have been there then, but I actually played a hooker in a play on the stage at Unity for money. It was a fundraiser, and we took it to wineries and even did this. So I guess I can speak here, right? Our theme is interconnection, and that's what we have here. I think everyone in this room who's been here before, everyone up there on that screen, you know we're interconnected. You feel it. You feel it because there is one presence. There is one power in this universe, and in my life and in yours, God the good. So it's pretty easy to talk about interconnection. It really is, because I feel it. I feel it deep in my soul. I have felt it since the beginning, way before I ever found a Unity church. I've gone to so many churches, guys. I've gone to, Baptist churches when I was a kid, Nazarene churches, extra right-wing churches. I've gone to synagogues. I've had the blessing of worshiping in Buddhist temples in Vietnam and in Thailand. And guess what? There is a message of love that permeates. I don't care what religion and what church you go to. I can go to any of them and I can get that truth. And that's what our Unity principles are about. Our Unity principles don't belong to Unity. I mean, they really capture truth. And you can hear them no matter what church you go to. So my title is Signposts, Source, and Synchronicity. Try to say that one a few times, right? Brian got me started last week because yours was S after S after, it was this alliteration. And the reason I wanted to share these three terms, is that words can be triggers. Religious words can be triggers. And again, I've been to a lot of different churches, as you probably have too. And sometimes those words are offered to you in love, but they can trigger. They can trigger sadness. They can trigger feelings that aren't good. And so I wanted to talk about that because words like God, Jesus, Abba, presence, universe, whatever we call that amazing, ubiquitous good that fills our universe, fills everything in our universe, fills you. That ubiquitous good is so much love. It's amazing. So if I say a word today that might cause you to go, ooh, maybe that causes a reaction from your history. And I don't intend on doing that, but guys, I'm just so full of love and energy to be here and so blessed to be with you that I hope you'll accept it as love, okay? I have a signpost. I brought it from my backyard. Brian's going to hand it to me as an example, okay? I don't know if we can see. Yeah, we can see that on the camera. And I took this off my back fence as an example. I painted it years ago when I didn't live near the beach. Now I live near the beach. But it's a word, right? It's just a word. And when I sit in my beautiful home and I look out one window at all the trees and the flowers, and I've got my animals around me, and I look out the other window and here's the Victorian right out my front window. So I'm supposed to be here. And then I look out a different window and this sign is there. Because all of the good that I feel during my time of meditation and prayer, I can look out that window and it says, there's more good. It's just over there, right? It's just over there. And this is just a word. This sign is not the beach. So if I say the word source or I say the word God, that's not God. It's just like this sign. It's a pointer. I just want us to remember that. Religious words are just pointers and telling us to really get connected, that interconnection with God, and feel that love. Thank you, Brian. Oh, I think I have a splinter. All right, the other part of my talk is synchronicity. And Brian started us last week with synchronicity. And we ask everyone, kind of watch yourself during the week and find that synchronicity, that magic in your life. And I have a few slides. Chris is going to be my extra blessing in the back to put up some slides as I share with you, because I wanted to pull examples from life of synchronicity. And so when he puts it up there, the first one, Chris, if you'll find it, there we go. I want to introduce you to this family. This is Archie and Anne Marie Maxwell. Isn't that a great name? Anne Marie Maxwell. Archie and Anne Marie Maxwell with their daughters, Elizabeth Lawrence Maxwell and Mary Tom Park Maxwell. They are from Saltcoats, Ayrshire, Scotland. And this picture was taken in 1915. As you can see, they had some substance to them. See, they're in nice clothing. They're dressed well. They posed for a professional photographer, obviously. So these folks had some money. And Archie actually had the blessing of being born in America, of all things, when his folks were on holiday. You know, that's what the Brits say, we're going on holiday. When they were on holiday, they came to America. My goodness, in 1880. And Archie was born here in 1881. And so they obviously had some resources. And he went back to Scotland and then was raised there, ended up with an education, ended up being an engineer in the coal mines. And a signpost came to him one day saying, I think it's better in America. That little sign came to him. And of course, it was his choice whether to follow that little sign or not, as it is for us when those little signs pop up. But if you'll put the next slide up, Chris, in a sec. So Archie, by that time, had 3 children. Little James Stewart Maxwell had joined the family. And Archie booked them transportation on this. This is the Coronia. It left Glasgow on April 29th, 1922. Now, this is not the Love Boat. No. This is not your Princess Cruise. These immigrant type ships, these type of companies would pack 2,000 to 3,000 people on that ship. And often the only way you got fed is a bucket would be brought to your little room with food in it. Other examples showed there would be these long, skinny tables in a tight room that you could sit there and eat and then go back up to your quarters, but you were packed on there. That ship took 10 days across the Atlantic. So imagine what that felt like. Now, what would happen when these immigration ships would come to America? They would pull in at Staten Island, and health officials would get on board and check for diseases like cholera. Because if there was an outbreak, that ship would be turned around and sent back. So imagine how awful that would be. In this one's case, in the case of the Coronia that time, it was able to pull into New York Harbor, and Archie, with a few other Americans, were able to get off. But everyone else, including Annie and her 3 children, were listed as immigrating aliens. They were listed as immigrating aliens. So they were put on a ferry and taken to Ellis Island. So Chris, if you'll put that example up. How many of you here have heard of Ellis Island? Oh, look at all the hands. Have you been there? Anybody been there? Peggy's been there, a few have been there. The estimate is at least 40% of Americans have had relatives come through Ellis Island. And from 1892 until 1954, over 12 million people came through this stop. It's right in New York Harbor. I've had the blessing of going there twice, once just last month. And there is an energy there, guys. There's an amazing amount of love and amazing amount of fear that has gone through that place. Because imagine you're getting off that ferry, all your earthly possessions now are in this luggage that you have with you, and you're asked to leave that on dockside. And usually a piece of chalk would be used and they'd write a number on it and then write a number on you and then send you into the Great Hall. So Chris, when you get a chance, put up the Great Hall. And what would happen, imagine if you didn't speak English and this is happening to you. Imagine what our ancestors went through. So here's the Great Hall. I apologize for the graininess of it, but probably a lot of your relatives were in there. And as you can see, it's just line after line, cordoned off, and you're standing there with your paperwork and hoping to pass all of the checkpoints. And at those checkpoints, they're checking for numerous things, but including over 60 diseases. Because if you are deemed too ill to come into America, you're sent packing also. If you're actually very sick, they'll take you to the hospital on Ellis Island. But they'll evaluate you, and if they can't cure you, you're going to be put right back on one of those ships and sent right back to where you came from. And that was the agreement with those companies, those shipping companies. One of the people who was most feared, if you were in that line, was the doctor with the button hook. And what they were looking for was a disease called trachoma, which was an eye disease, very infectious eye disease. And the button hook would be used to turn your eyelids inside out to check for that. And here's the irony. They didn't change button hooks between people. Yeah, so think what our relatives went through, guys, to get here, right? But when imagine you're Annie Maxwell, and you're in line with 3 little kids in this big line. It could take hours to get through it, or it could take days at some points. But they're going through these checkpoints, and they're listed again as immigrating aliens. And then what happens? But Jim, the littlest, the 6-year-old, is designated as too sick to enter. And so they take the little boy and they take him to the big hospital on Ellis Island. And have any of you gone through the hospital? If you go back, do it. It's absolutely worth whatever they charge. It's not restored, but you get in there and you see the morgue, which is huge, but you also see the rooms and these little old cots in these rooms with the big glass windows. And you imagine you would be lying in that bed, and out through that window is the Statue of Liberty. Right out there, you're that close of becoming an American. Little Jim was sick. And imagine being the mother of that child. And now that baby's been taken away from you. He's 6 years old, but he's been taken away from you. And she and her 2 daughters were sent to a dormitory in the 2nd level of the Great Hall. And up there were just stacks of these metal frame bunk beds that our relatives would have been sent to, and you have to stay there. And you're in there with people from all countries, right? All different languages. You don't really know what's happening. They stayed there 2 weeks. And then Jim got better, because the hospital there actually was quite good, one of the best in America in 1922, because let's face it, it was a teaching hospital. And they got exposed to just about every kind of illness you can imagine. So that was one of the best hospitals in the United States. So little Jim comes out of the hospital, reunited with his mom and his 2 sisters. They're put on a barge and they're going to New Jersey. Right across the water is this huge train station. You can still see it there. And that's where most of our relatives entered America. And so Archie met up with a family, and off they go, and up to all places, to Terre Haute, Indiana. Yeah, because that's where there's a lot of coal industry there. And Archie's trained, as an engineer. So let's put up, now we're talking about synchronicity, remember, and interconnectedness. If you'll put up the next slide. This next person I want to introduce you to his name is James Hoover. There he is. I'm sorry, it's a poor slide, but If you've ever tried to do research on people of color, it's very hard to find much information. We have lovely historical societies throughout this country, but for the most part, they're about white European background people. It's hard to find that much information. But Dr. James Hoover, he was born in Mississippi in 1881. So imagine that. That's not even 20 years after the Emancipation Proclamation went into law. And so imagine the life he had. Now, I could not find records on him, but the likelihood is his parents, for sure his grandparents, were probably slaves. But this young man, when he was young, this is an older picture of him, but when he was young, he embodied that second unity principle that we talked about this morning, that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and that we are created in the image and love of God, and therefore human beings are inherently good. Now imagine being a black man in Mississippi, or a black child in Mississippi, with that belief. People are inherently good, even though what are you seeing, how are you being treated, right? But he was driven. He was driven to serve others. And so, through the grace of God, he ended up at Alcorn University, which was one of the first black universities in the South. And then he was able to transfer to Meharry Medical School, which was the first medical school in the South. He was driven to serve. And he graduated in 1923, and guess where he went? Terre Haute, Indiana. He followed basically a path of the Underground Railroad, which led right up from the South, and he ended up in Terre Haute, Indiana. Now, we're talking about the 20s. He established a medical practice, a little one, that served African Americans, because African Americans were very, very underserved medically, especially. There were 3 large hospitals in Terre Haute at that time, in the 20s, but not one of them would treat someone of color. You could come in and clean the floor, but you can't get treated. Actually, even up into the 50s, I remember the stories of people like Dr. Hoover. They could go into the big department stores and look at the clothing. You can't try it on. Same way with shoes. Imagine buying shoes. You can't try them on. But you can buy them. You can't return them. So anyway, this was what was happening. But what was happening? Do you remember what was happening in America at the end of the 20s? Anybody? The Great Depression? I know my parents lived through the Great Depression. Probably some of yours did too. Times were tough, and times were extremely tough for Black people, absolutely. So we've now established that the Maxwell, the Scottish people, are in Terre Haute, and Dr. Hoover and his family are now. He's married, he has 2 sons, and they're in Terre Haute. And we're going to skip ahead now. Chris, if you'll put up the next slide. This is what Laura looks like by the 40s. That rich little girl that, it was Elizabeth. Her name was Elizabeth Lawrence. She went by Laura. She was the elder child in the first picture. She's now extremely poor. She had 4 children, but her daughter by this stage has been taken away from her. There was barely enough food to feed the kids. Hardly any food. I was talking about being cold this morning. Some of you had mentioned how cold it was this morning. Imagine living in a little wooden house in Terre Haute, Indiana in the winter and not having enough money to even get the wood to put in the little stove. The kids said that they would sleep all huddled next to that little stove on that wooden floor. Laura was alone by this time because her husband of many years had, she always knew that he had girlfriends. Well, he had created another child with one of them, and so they separated. So now she had no income. Her husband's left, and she's got the kids. And on top of that, there was a mother-in-law right across the alley who was very strict and very demanding and controlling, and she took the daughter from her, saying, "You're unfit to raise these kids, and I'm taking the daughter." And the daughter became her maid, basically. So it was just terrible. It was just terrible. And so Laura is left in this situation. Now, by this time, both Laura has kids, Mary has kids, both the Maxwells have had another boy, sweet Alex, and he's just barely old enough, but he went off to serve in World War II also. But so things have progressed just like happens in our lives, right? Things happen. Life happens. And by this stage, what also happened was Laura found out she was pregnant. Now she's 38 years old, almost 39 years old, no husband, no income, still trying to hang on to the 3 boys you saw up there. And she really hadn't been raised with a faith in God, but that I can find from the Maxwells that I've talked to. None of them really they didn't go to churches, they didn't have a spiritual practice. But by this time, what happened is Laura literally fell to her knees. She surrendered. And how many of you have gone to that point? Have you ever been to that point where you just finally surrender? I have. And it actually can be one of the best days of your life when you finally let go, when you finally surrender control. Because again, we're spiritual beings having a human experience. That human experience includes the ego, and we're trying to control things, and we're trying to think things through, and trying to manage life, right? And finally, when we let go and let God, miracles happen. So Laura was making a living by cleaning houses. She was taking in laundry. She did have an employer. She got on as a janitor at a high school, but still barely making it. And one of the houses she cleaned, I think there's another slide, right, Chris? Yes, the next slide, if you'll put it up. One of the houses she cleaned, this was a real interesting synchronicity type thing, was a woman named Frances Boyer Johnson. And she was a spiritualist. Are you familiar with the term spiritualist? She was a psychic and a card reader. If we go back, not that one, but the one with Frances Boyer Johnson. There she is. She led services in her home and at a nearby spiritualist church. And the Historical Society there sent me a picture yesterday, a 3-story building in downtown Terre Haute, and the top floor was the Spiritualist Center. So people from all walks of life, all faith backgrounds, would get together there, and they would be still. They would try to get their egos aside, their racing brains aside, and they would meditate together, and then they would get messages. And Frances Boyer was one of those people. Now, interesting enough, she would hold these services in her home. And remember, Laura's cleaning the house, and these services are happening in her home. And these messages would come to her. So in order to make some money, Frances Johnson was a card reader. And she didn't use tarot cards or anything like that. She used just a pack of playing cards. And I've talked with her granddaughter, and her granddaughter said, it was interesting, Grandma didn't need the cards. She had a knowing. But she would have the customer shuffle and lay the cards out. And that helped the customer focus and be still. And then she said, Grandma could read them. She would just know. And so this was happening, and Laura was hiding her pregnancy. And I'm here to tell you, her kids didn't know she was pregnant. Her mother and father didn't know if she was pregnant. She knew that she had to do something. She would wear these big baggy clothes and still work. And her mother-in-law, who was across the alley, was threatening to take the boys from her because it was hard to feed them. And her mother-in-law said, you're unfit, and I'm going to put those boys in the orphanage. And there were 2 orphanages right there in Terre Haute. So Laura was under threat that she was going to lose her entire family. And she's working for the spiritualists, and she had a card reading, and Frances Boyer had a knowing. She knew this woman needed help, and she knew just what to do. And so our last slide, I promise, Brian, you don't have to get the hook. I'm almost done. Remember in vaudeville, they'd get the big hook. That's enough. Okay, the last slide we'll put up. These people, Pep and Fanny. Can you tell from these images, they're fun people. These are loving people, fun people. They lived about 30 miles north. And they embody that message about unity. We talk about what is our fifth principle is knowledge of these principles isn't enough. You got to live your life living these principles, loving other people, loving yourself, giving your heart and connecting with people. And these two people did that. Pep, his actual name was Oscar, but he never went by Oscar because Pep was peppy. He never knew. Fanny said he could talk to a signpost, it was like. And Fanny was gregarious. Her actual name was Frances, but Fanny was a lover. She was about yay tall and about yay wide. So nickname Fanny was perfect, right? And they were loving people, but they were poor. And they ran a farm for a farmer up in Dana, Indiana. And Fanny had never been able to have children. She had had a serious surgery when she was in high school, and she almost died. And they took out a lot of her intestine, and they took out her female organs. So as much as she wanted to have children, she couldn't. So she and Pep were running this farm. And remember, Laura is about 30 miles south, on her knees, praying for God to give her guidance. And Fanny was working this farm. The farm was wonderful. The men would work the fields, and Fanny would take care of the animals. She loved baby pigs. She loved the chickens. She celebrated with dogs and cats. She always had lots of dogs and cats around. But she had gotten ill. And this is right at the end of July 1950. She was sick. And of course, medicine's not all that great in those days, but Pep did drive her into Paris, Illinois, across the border. That's where she grew up. And the doctor said, I think it's your heart. It sounds to me like your heart's really struggling, and I'm not sure how much longer you have. And she was only 38. The doctor said the word aneurysm. And Fanny was getting weaker and weaker. And she got to the point she couldn't even get off the couch. She couldn't help with the animals. She couldn't feed the guys before they went out to the fields. And then this happened one day. She was lying on the couch in this big old Indiana farmhouse, and her little dog came to her and licked her face and needed to go outside, right? So Fanny got herself up and opened the big old wooden screen door, the big old heavy wooden screen doors. And if you've ever seen those houses in the Midwest, there's no yard, there's no fences, right? Everything's wide open, big old white house. And so normally the little dog would go out on the porch, down a few steps, do its business and come back. This time it didn't. Fanny's there holding onto the door jamb, and the dog goes out down the steps and starts running. Now out in front, it's wide open, and out in front, there's a little bit of a yard, then an old gravel road, country road, and then on the other side is a field with a train track. And a train whistle blows. And Fanny's heart drops, and she starts screaming. Her little dog's name was Jody. Jody, Jody, come back. And Jody keeps running. And Fanny gets out on that porch, Jody! And then Fanny falls down the stairs. And what happened is, Fanny said, what happened is I found myself racing through space. She said, I was surrounded by this bright white light, and I was racing toward this bright white light. And my whole life was like swirling around me. People I had seen before, people I loved, animals I'd had in the past, experiences I'd had, they were swirling around me like those toys we used to have. You remember those kaleidoscopes? Did you ever have a kaleidoscope with the glass beads in it, and you'd turn it and it'd make beautiful images? She said her life was swirling like this, and she wasn't afraid, and she's racing to this white life when it all stops. And there's a voice that says, send this one back. I have work for her. When Fanny came to, she's on the ground. She's a little bit bruised, but she said it felt like, did you ever hit your funny bone? My mom used to say, I hit my funny bone. Remember that as a kid? And for some reason, it would like stun us to the point, I don't know, we're paralyzed. Well, Fanny said it felt like she'd hit her funny bone, but with her whole body. It was like on fire. But she got in the house, and she got on the couch, and she realized I don't know if I can even tell anybody this story. Who's going to believe that? But in a couple of days, her strength was coming back. Suddenly, she could get up and fix the meals for the men. Suddenly, she could take care of the little pigs and the chickens. And within 2 weeks, her brother came to her. Her brother lived in Terre Haute. He drives out to the farm and says, I want to talk to you and Pep. So they sat down at the old table and he said, I know of a woman in trouble who needs a home for a baby. And I know you've always wanted children. Now, Pep and Fanny were thrilled, but also a little bit wary because they had tried to adopt 3 times and it always failed. And the last time had been a beautiful African-American baby. And they came this close to being parents of that baby when the mother pulled it back and said, no, I'm not letting go of this baby. So Pep and Fanny were anxious and said, but will they let us? We've always been told we're too old, that we've always been told we're too poor. The government just doesn't let us have a baby. And her brother said, this time's going to be different. Dr. Hoover's handling the entire adoption. Dr. Hoover, the African-American man who had opened, by the way, the very first hospital for African Americans in Terre Haute. He had purchased a home on 8th Avenue, and then he purchased the one next door. He now had a 40-bed hospital serving African Americans, and he would serve others too. And so they drove into town, filled out all the paperwork, and here's where the magic of synchronicity comes together. On August 13th, 1950, Laura goes into labor. Now remember, this woman's so poor. She doesn't have a car. She doesn't even know how to drive. But her friend, the card reader, has sent her to Dr. Hoover's sanitarium. So she starts walking to the African American section of town. And meanwhile, of course, she gets there and Dr. Hoover welcomes her in, this tiny little pregnant white lady, takes her into the labor and delivery room, and he places a call to Pep and Fanny. The baby's on the way. So they get in the old jalopy and they start heading to Terre Haute. And they're there about 2 hours later, and they're sitting in that little waiting room. So imagine yourself, this tiny little waiting room in an African-American clinic, waiting for your baby to be born. And this crazy woman comes pounding on the door, this irate white woman, and it turns out to be Laura's mother-in-law, who's been there, peeking at the whole thing. I think my daughter-in-law's in here having a baby, and I demand to know if she's pregnant. Well, Dr. Hoover, he's faced a lot worse than an angry old white woman, right? So he had Laura, and this little bed she's on, he had the staff roll her into a janitor's pantry. Kind of apropos for someone who's a janitor, right? But so he hides the white woman, and then he escorts her name was Mrs. Goodrich, and for some reason she had some power over people in that town, but he escorts her into the small labor and delivery room, and a black lady had just given birth, and he goes, congratulations, it's a boy, here's this beautiful black baby. She's outraged, storms out of the hospital, of course, and Pep and Fanny are there like, well, what's going on, Anyway, synchronicity, the love of God. I'm that baby that was born in a janitor's pantry in Terre Haute, Indiana, on August 13th, 1950. And I went home with Pep and Fanny 3 days later to a big old white farmhouse filled with animals and the love of God. And when I was about in my 30s, I met Laura and I met the whole family. And we put the story together. But guess what? I didn't find out who my father was, really, until 4 years ago. Because Laura lied to me. She said I had the same daddy as everybody else. And she just had loved the one man so much, she let him back into the house. But, DNA doesn't lie. So I found out my paternal grandmother is the psychic Frances Boyer Johnson. She arranged the entire adoption. I am so blessed to stand here with you. I have an enormous love for all people and all animals, and I have an enormous love for God that started way back there in Terre Haute, Indiana. I thank you so much.